Good evening. My name is Antara Patro and I am a guest lecturer in the Department of English in ND College, affiliated to University of Calcutta. I welcome you to the project series on working women TMYS Review December 2025 will explore the theme of working women in literature. We are calling for the submission of essays, poems, interviews, and short stories under the project. To know more about the submission guidelines and the project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Professor Rajeev Kamineni, Rianka Sarkar, Professor Nishi Mitra from Berg, and Dr. K. Suneetha Rani, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is responsibilities, ambitions, achievements. Is the workplace a better home? Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for this session is Professor Rajeev Kamineni. Professor Kamineni is living in Australia since 1997. He is passionate about movies and education and fortunate to work in both the industries. Dr. Rajeev Kamineni started his working career in a bookstore 3 decades ago and then moved on to area sales manager, director, executive director, chief officer, and head of program positions. He has working stints in Australia, Dubai, Japan, India, Singapore, and South Africa. Rajiv sir was actively involved in financing 35 movies and producing 14 movies in the Indian movie industry. With a lifelong passion for cinema, Rajiv has authored a book of Indian cinema published by Routledge, UK. He was also actively involved as an organizer and executive committee member of the Chennai International Film Festival. Currently academic director and teaching management for University of Adelaide's students, Rajiv is an active Rotarian, is a member of Rotary Club of Adelaide, served as its 100th president in 2022 to until 23, and is the Rotary District Governor nominee. We are delighted to have you on the panel, Professor Kamineni. Thank you for joining us this session.
Thank you, Antara.
Our second speaker for the session is Ms. Rianka Sarkar. Rianka Sarkar is a Bangalore based children's writer and an environmentalist. She is an assistant professor of English at Mount Carmel Autonomous College. She has authored her debut book, Reconstructing the Border History, Rethinking Space, and has been published in various anthologies and journals for her poetry, short stories, and articles. She is an active member of the International Journal of Creative Research Thoughts. She is a gold medalist from Guru Nanak Dev University and has published papers on the partition history and narratives, folk tales, and cultural studies. Welcome on board, Ms. Sarkar, and thank you to be present among us. Our third speaker is Professor Nishi Mitra Berg, professor and the chairperson of the Advanced Center for Women's Studies, chairperson of the Women and Gender Development SAIL, and professor at the for Study of Developing Societies in Tata Institute of Social Sciences in India. Professor Nishi is an anthropologist engaged in cross cultural and comparative research on feminist themes in India, US, Sweden, UK, Germany, Canada, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Australia, Afghanistan, etc. She has researched and published on gender issues, including women in academia, family and intimate partner violence, sexual violence, marital rape, child marriages, femicide, etc. She led the development and launch of the first master's program in women's studies in India and is currently engaged in research on gender and housing, minorities on campus, education for social change and social inclusion, decolonizing curriculums, and women's leadership in academia. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, Professor Nishi. Thank you for joining us. Our fourth speaker for the session is Dr. K. Suneetha Rani. Dr. K. Suneetha Rani is a professor at the Center for Women's Studies and Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Hyderabad. She previously taught English for 15 years before transitioning to women's studies. Her research interests include gender studies, cultural studies, comparative studies, new literatures in English, translation studies, and feminist pedagogy. Her PhD in English literature focused on Australian Aboriginal women's autobiographies. She translates between Telugu and English and has published numerous articles and translations. Her major publications include Identities and Assertions, Dalit Women's Narratives, The Rock That Was Not, and Critical Discourse in Telugu and others. She has translated works such as Nelly Nira, Australia Adivasi Ammavi Atmakatha, and Darulu Tapin Chukune Darulu into Telugu. Dr. Suneetha Rani is the editor of Gender Handbooks for Students and Teachers, commissioned by Samagra Shiksha, Telangana, and funded by UNICEF. She also serves as the series editor of Gender Studies at Rupkatha Books, as president of the executive committee of Bhumika Women's Collective. She advocates against gender based violence. Currently, she is working on a UNICEF funded project exploring gender assumptions among adolescent boys in Telangana. We are pleased to have you with us this evening, Dr. Suneetha Rani. Thank you for joining us today. Now, we will open the forum for discussion. And I would request our first speaker, Professor Rajeev Kamineni, to share his insights. Sir, over to you now.
Thank you, Antara. So the topic is quite interesting because it's something which is very close to my heart. When I teach consumer behavior, I tell that the students there are three places in which a human being finds comfort and safety. One is their home, one is their office, and one is their social setting. So when we are as growing up as a kids, we have home, school, and a playground. Three places. When we grow up into adults, we have home, office, and a social setting like a club or a pub or wherever or a book club or a library. So when the topic was Antara sent me the topic mentioning about women feeling safer at workplace and how do they relate to the workplace. My mom used to always say when she was a pediatrician, and she used to say that no matter what stress she had in her real life, how bringing up two kids, working full time, the moment she went into the hospital and put on the robe of a doctor in her office, she said all the stress melted away because her life has changed over there, because she's so comfortable in that setting. And for lots of men, women, especially for women, when they go into the office, it's a safe space. They switch off from their other roles and they bring in that perspective into there, and they feel happy that they have an ambition over there, they have a career, they have a role in that office. And it's not the role which is probably secondary or third to someone, it's a role which gives them an identity. And people carry their name badges with pride to say that I'm working in this company, because that's an identity. And you take away from that from them, they feel very lonely and lost. And office is a space which gives that opportunity. So when someone has an ambition to achieve something in life, office is where they say, okay, that's where my ambition goes on. And safe space, it can be very male dominated or it can be very female dominated office. That's secondary, the domination part. But what I'm doing is every morning at 9 a.m. I go from my home to an office, and I work there till 5 o'clock. So that means 8 to 9 hours in a day I'm spending at a place where I'm safe. And that is my second home. That people say, why do you spend so much time in your office? I am comfortable in my office. So for me personally, and I've seen several women entrepreneurs, women business people. I was talking to a woman, a movie producer. She has three kids and her husband is an actor, but she is producing movies. I said, why did you want to get into production? She said, that's the only place I can spend quality time with my husband. I said, what do you mean? Yes, he works three shifts as an actor. He's never at home, he's always on set. So one day I decided I'll become a movie producer. And I'll become a movie producer because my husband will work in my movie. That way I can spend more time with him. So that is, you're treating the workplace or your career as a surrogate for what you're missing in the real life, in the home life. So that's an advantage. And they might be there might be bullying, there might be harassment at workplace, but at the end of the day, that's where you're choosing to go, either out of necessity or out of your career options. So I would say that office is a safe space and it's a second part of our life. Just like home is where we all feel happy, even at office, we feel at home. So that's my point to start with. Thank you, Antra.
Thank you, sir. That was really interesting. Like in this corporate world, it is really rare to say people that office feels like home. But
Yes.
yeah, so that was really interesting. With this note, I'll invite our second speaker, Miss Rianka Sarkar, to deliver her perspective on this topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Antara. I think the topic that we are discussing today. It's a kind of a provocative question, and particularly discussing it through the lens of Indian women's. I'll be choosing particularly autobiographical narratives in terms of talking about the concept of home. So we typically imagine, it to be a sanctuary which is comfort and belonging. But what happens is that when a home becomes a site of constraint and the workplace becomes a space of liberation. So this is what I'll be discussing in terms of, four memoirs that I would like to talk about. Now, the first memoir that I'm discussing is this, Shantabai Kamble's Revolutionary Voice. Now, Shantabai Kamble is a pioneering Dalit, feminist writer, and she reveals in her writing how the concept of home was fundamentally different from, for women from the marginalized communities. And for Kamble, home wasn't just, gendered oppression; it was a caste-based, you can say, exclusion layered with patriarchal control. So the paradox of home itself exists in terms of the caste. Talking about Kamble, she shatters the romanticized notion of Indian joint family as a very protective sanctuary, which is very true because we have been somewhere internalized to believe that, the concept of joint family is, created in a way to provide shelter and protection to women. Now, in her autobiographical work, she exposes how domestic spaces reinforces both untouchability and women's subordination, starting from the kitchen, whether traditionally it is seen as women's domain. And this becomes a site of very ritual pollution and endlessly, or you can say, unacknowledged labor. She also reveals the truth in her narrative about the brutal reality that the Dalit women face, that is, home becomes a double prison, firstly confined by the caste hierarchy and then the gender roles simultaneously. So she describes how within the own community, women's inappropriateness struggles through the situation, and also talks about internalizing how women are internalizing shame imposed by the caste society. Now, another poignant thing that we notice here is that the concept of working women for probably the lower strata of society is very, very dicey because they have always had to work. There's nothing called non-working for them. They were always working, and they were meagerly paid. So they will be probably working outside where they might face a lot of harassment. Back home, also a kind of, very few of them would be probably privileged to not face a harassment, and then back home also work again. So the shift of work does not end once you're back, because let's say for a middle class society, if you are working outside, you would employ somebody to work at home. But what about that person who works in your house? For that person, the work in my house is the job, and then she goes back and works for herself because she doesn't have anybody to work for her. Now, another, biography that I'm picking up is Unfinished by Priyanka Chopra Jonas, which went viral and everybody spoke about it and was also met with a lot of criticism. However, we know Priyanka Chopra as being very vocal about, women and women's rights and how to make women's life very easy. And Unfinished, her book presents a very different but equally very compelling narrative about home and workspace. So she describes growing up in a middle class Indian family, and while loving, she was constrained by conventional expectations, probably in terms of women's roles and ambitions. However, Chopra also dismantles the myth that family love is enough for women's fulfillment. And Priyanka Chopra is very vocal about certain things, which is why probably she, earned a lot of controversy. So she reveals how even supportive families can inadvertently limit, women's aspirations, probably through well-meaning concerns or dictating an appropriate career choices or pressurized to prioritize marriage and motherhood, which is ultimately considered to be, what a woman has to achieve in life. Now, the best part is, how Chopra advocates the concept of a very fearless self-advocacy and the importance of, building one's own support system. So she suggests that women must be willing to disappoint others to avoid disappointing themselves. And this is a key insight. You have to be willing to be misunderstood for a while, to be misunderstood on your own terms later. When she makes such a bold statement, definitely, she came into controversy. However, she doesn't stop there as she frames the narrative of the concept of, working women, probably in a middle class or upper section of the society. And she says that women have to draw the boundaries and learn to say no, learn to, question, learn to become bad, learn to not always be, the good side of the society, the good side of expectations. If you have to choose yourself, if you have to choose and prioritize yourself and your happiness. The third memoir that I'm discussing is Memories of a Rolling Stone, and this is by Veena Mazumdar. Veena Majumdar is an academic activist, and Memories of a Rolling Stone offers a very fascinating perspective of how intellectual work can transform the relationship between home and workplace. Now, many people do not consider probably an NGO or an activism to be a full-time work. And Majumdar just explores this concept of, how the scholars and activists are, how workplace can be very different for them in terms of gender. Now, Veena Majumdar confronts the myth that educated women can, have it all without sacrifice or struggle, which is probably, considered to be very easy for educated women. But Veena Majumdar, she questions this kind of, accepted belief, and also reveals how the expectations to excel in both domestic and professional spheres created a very impossible burden, particularly for women pursuing intellectual careers and that demanded total commitment, because the concept of intellectualism is again pushed. Women are kind of pushed into the fringes most of the time in terms of intellectualism, and they are considered to be threatening the male space if they are seen to be more intellectual or brighter, even in terms of degrees. So this is very common in matrimonial aspects, where many women who are probably way more qualified, they have stated that they couldn't find a right match because either they had been choosing finding a man, or the men didn't want the woman to be more knowledgeable and having a better degree than them. Now, her memoir also exposes the hidden cost of being a pioneering professional woman in academia. So she describes the constant guilt of, choosing research over domestic duties, the isolation from other women who couldn't understand her choices, and the professional world's expectation, that she prove herself twice as hard as her male colleagues. And another thing that Mazumdar advocates is the strategic importance of women's networks and mentorship. So she suggests that women must create their own support system from professional spaces, since traditional support structure often, fail to help ambitious women. And henceforth, the her key insight comes with the idea that individual liberation without collective action is, incomplete liberation. The last biography that I'm going to talk about is Mina Alexander's Fault Lines. And this is a poignant example of cultural displacement and professional identity. Now, Mina Alexander's Fault Lines, it adds another dimension to our exploration by, examining how migration and cultural displacement, affect the home workspace dynamic. And as a poet and, an academician, for her, who moved between India, Sudan, and America, so her relationship with home was inherently very complex. Now, Alexander challenges the myth of cultural authenticity and the idea that home is a fixed geographical or cultural space. And she also reveals how, the romanticized notion of homeland can become a burden for migrant women, creating impossible expectations from cultural preservation and identity. Another thing that is extremely crucial and which most women face is the shift in terms of workspace and home, where we are expected to juggle our work, choose a job which can create compatibility with the husband or the spouse, and accordingly balance. So it's like, if you want to work outside, you work, but then you have to pick something where you can balance everything. So you cannot, if you want everything in your plate, you will have to somewhere pick a career which will allow you to balance the other things as well. Now, her memoir also exposes the profound disorientation of cultural displacement and how the traditional support system collapses across borders. So, what is very much applicable in terms of probably the Indian social scenario? Let's say that here we are working and we do have domestic house help to, help us back at home. And I think one, lady rightly said this: behind every successful woman and a career woman, it is a very good domestic help. So now talking about somebody who's probably working abroad, an Indian expatriate or somebody who's working there, the family carries the same kind of notion from India, only to expect the woman should be handling the kitchen as well. The workload in the house is not balanced. So, this describes the painful reality that migration often means choosing between the cultural, continuity and personal growth, and also between honoring family traditions or embracing new opportunities. Now, Alexander also advocates for embracing cultural multiplicity rather than seeking a very singular identity, where migrant women must create their own definition of home, be it in terms of socializing, networking with other women, building their own identity, and knowing their rights, which is very important. Now, this four narratives reveals the question that, is the workplace a better home? Isn't simply about, it's not just about choosing between domestic and professional space. Instead, these women's stories rather suggest that the workplace can provide very essential elements that are traditionally associated with home, for instance, belonging or identity or community and the freedom of, to be fully oneself. Of course, financial independence is something which is very, very important and rightly pointed out by all these writers that it's very important when you have the money in your pocket that you can take certain decisions for yourself. And it is not necessary that it turns you into arrogance, but it can also help you in terms of building a partnership in a relationship. And the struggles of probably the working women in a traditional home, they kind of offer a kind of what do you call it, a message to all the contemporary society, all the women, to rethink the term working women, because it gives a kind of a citation that there are also non-working women. I mean, as somebody who's probably not going outside and working, isn't it that they are not working enough, or their work is not acknowledged, or only we are considering work that is being monetized to be a work? So all these writers have focused and pointed out between when we work outside versus when we are working indoors, and how women's work often fails to receive the acknowledgement. Thank you, Atara.
Thank you, ma'am. You have addressed the topic from various perspectives, and thank you for that. Now I go forward to our third speaker, Professor Nishi. Over to you. Please deliver your perspective on it.
So much. Thank you so much. So I will go a little bit connected with what Rianka has been talking about, this false divide between paid and unpaid work, and also the different locations, different feminist questions that have been asked from the women's perspective in terms of both the attraction of paid work as well as the dilemmas uh, which women face and which they have centered in the autobiographies, which pertain to the fact that women and their connection to work is critical because of the way home and workplace got divided, especially at the time of industrialization and the growth of capitalism, a kind of domestication of women, uh, particularly belonging to the upper class, and the and which meant that when you are talking about responsibilities, ambitions, achievements, and the workplace as a better home, we cannot talk of this only in the present context for women represented in the corporate office or in the academia. We also need to talk about the history of women and women's lives in terms of their contributions to the country's development through their work, where it is located, the distinction made between production and reproduction, and the way women's work, uh, particularly reproductive work, gets devalued and decentered in our understanding of workplaces. So women and their sexual segregation in modern workspaces also has to be seen in the light of how home is a workplace where gender is very much playing a defining role in terms of who is doing housework, and this housework which is not paid, which is gendered. And yes, uh, Rianka was talking about the significance of housemaids, but not everybody can afford housemaids. And what happens to housemaids when they work in, let's say, feminist women's homes or modern women's homes, who, when women have to go and work out their identity in workspaces. So in some ways, the feminist questions are about how not only gender, but the interlinkage of work with poverty, with caste, with ethnicity, with race, and so many other social variables which intersect women's lives in terms of their autonomy and their control over their um, own life and what they generate. So we are talking about responsibilities, ambitions, and achievements, and all this seems very attractive. But a lot of feminist writing is talking about the strain on women in working out these dilemmas in a patriarchal context, where one, they are constructed as dependent. uh, it's a catch-22 situation. They are wholly responsible for housework, and their economic dependency which gets constructed and structured in this patriarchal context is also used to further marginalize them in terms of their status. So, work is status. At the same time, housework is a labor of love, and it is neither paid nor is it valued. And so this general devaluation, and we also see that whenever women who are working in certain spaces, they get replaced by men. The men working in those spaces, that is valued more. So this sexual segregation, also its extension in terms of certain areas of work which are not considered to be work at all. Let's say what the term sex work or the term care work. These are feminist achievements in terms of talking about prostitution as sex work. Okay, so what was seen as no work but a tabooed status is something which is being reclaimed as working with one's body, thinking of work differently from the traditional conceptualization of work with hands, work with the brain. But we're talking about women and women working with their bodies, even with their genitals when we're talking about sex work. So there is this reclamation is about uh, constructing a kind of continuation in women's lives and pointing out how the idea of work is itself patriarchal and produces a certain kind of dependency of women and fixes them onto that. The idea of second shift, which is a concept also brought out by feminists, uh, is in that sense talking about two workspaces. So there's the workspace which is valued and where there is compensation, and there is a workspace which starts back home, which is not really compensated. And at the same time, it's not just a labor of love. It needs, things need to be done. The children need to be fed. The house needs to be managed, to be cleaned. People need to rest, and women don't enjoy that leisure even when so-called work finishes. So I want to tell you a little bit from a little research I was engaged in some years ago with women in academia. And we were looking at feminist narratives about work. And we were also looking at particularly academic women who are mothers, because the main critique of housework has come from women who are mothers, who are talking about this housework seem to be as a labor of love, as something which is exploitative, which is transgressive, about women's boundaries as an individual, which is also violent, but it can also at times be, in some ways, um, you know, making women feel good. There is a certain identity and status linked to women as mothers in societies, particularly in Indian society. The understanding of women as mothers, as something, as women exuding a certain kind of moral power, a certain kind of control and decision making power. So we tried to talk to academics, and particularly to those who are engaged in either feminist questions or in social work and social change, social movements, etc., and who are in some ways exploring the significance of women's work and women's participation in the public spaces, which have traditionally been denied to them. And we try to look at the power and powerlessness of these women in academia and in homes. And through sharing what has come out of this research, I would like to address the question of responsibilities, ambitions, and achievement. Is the workplace a better home? So the fundamental understanding was coming from a philosopher called Sarah Rudick, who has done a work on mothering and mother's work. And she says that mother's work is inherently and profoundly an intellectual activity. Now, this is a very strong statement which says that when we take mother's work to be either something natural, biological, instinctual, she's talking about it as an intellectual activity. And she says that mothers think. Mothers are not just doing this as a biological act of nurturance or love and care for their children. While doing this work, they are also developing a standpoint. They are learning certain skills, and these skills of care is what is needed in our cultures. It is needed that not only women exude these skills, but this should be something that should be actively generated amongst people and through the act of mothering. So, maternal thinking got theorized by Sarah Rudick and some feminists as a distinct discipline with its own philosophy and practice. And it is something which emerges out of mother's work. Now, in most cultures, mothering is defined as a full time responsibility, and one that is something which is the most treasured attribute of women. And traditionally, women are denied thinking and reflecting traits. So, we wanted to look at how mothers, particularly in the developing world, and we had academics from Brazil, South Africa, and India look into their own lives and say what makes them still put mothering and homes on a pedestal. Why is it that they invest so much in the home? And how does their academic life inform them in doing this differently? Because is it that they make a simple critique of motherhood as oppressive and simplistic, or they have ambivalent attitudes? What are the feelings, beliefs, and values? How do they juggle these? What kind of positive and negative experiences they have? And can we actually straitjacket these two spaces? And how do they combine this role differently from male academics? What are their challenges? How do these thinking women who are theorizing making for a difference in terms of their approach to their homes and their workspaces? And most of the women we were talking were in the age group 35 to 67 years. There were several who were PhDs, some were pursuing their PhDs. Some had permanent tenures, some had temporary and contractual tenures. And we found that one of the most important things from this generation of academic women that came out was that they did not speak of a well thought out strategy or a career plan. So they were more talking themselves as having a career because they were well educated, they did well in their studies, but there was not like a well worked out career plan. And in fact, marriage happened something had to be kept aside, then work happened. It was like in that context that they are talking about the combination of the site of mothering with paid work, and was talking about how the career has made them who they are now, but they did not give it the required focus. So there was not always a regret, but there was a kind of an acknowledgement of the choice that they have made, and a kind of a stoic attitude at times when they were reporting about how the um, family related responsibilities made them cap their aspirations or not invest so much because there were long working hours, tiresome schedules, non-understanding colleagues and seniors, unstable childcare facilities, lack of dependable help, inability to meet the requirements and expectations of children and their teachers at school, inability to satisfy other members of the family, restricted social life, absence of entertainment and recreational activities, and a whole lot of stress creating factors, which made their lives in some ways burdensome and complicated. And at the same time, a kind of deep responsibility with which they approached their motherhood, and talked about the need for uh, doing this work in a way that was personally satisfying, that was making them put certain values in their children, and also acknowledging that academic work required focus and consistency, but also there were self-imposed um, you know uh, controls on their upward mobility, or in terms of their promotions. One of the important things was they were talking also like ordinary mothers about guilt and self doubt, about cultural definitions of what good wives and mothers are. So they were reflecting on their lives, and these autobiographical narratives, they were reporting about their ambivalence, but they were also talking about how they worked around it in terms of working at nights, the working with in networks with support of family, of spouse, of paid help, but also about refusing many opportunities just so that they could work out work life balance. One of the important things that came out was that their mothers were very pivotal and critical in their continuing their professions. So it was not the fathers. The fathers may have played a very important role in them, in their education, but in terms of their continuing to work, their own mothers had played very important role, which shows the stereotyping of care work in the family, because mothers were coming when these academics were pursuing their PhD, or when they had to travel abroad to attend a conference or to present a paper and things like that. So this was something which was also very important. They talked about rethinking family and how they were involved in making change at the level of their children and training them for a different way of organizing their families, such as cultivating skills of cooking in their sons, or getting them to think about and to re-envision gender relations. But other thing was that these women at workplaces in the academia were also mentors of students, and they were holding this as a very important work that they were doing. in terms of mentoring students. So while they might not have as many publications or as quick a mobility to being a professor, but they were very proud of their autonomy and self-reliance, and inculcating socially relevant perspectives in their children and in their students. So I would say, in the end, basically, they were accepting and honoring one's differentiation, had pride in one's achievement, and they were also conscious of the choices they were making, and were grateful for institutional practices and structures such as availability of 6 months of paid maternity leave, childcare leave, prolonged leave in case of illness of children, etc., flexibility in working hour arrangements, which they worked with colleagues and seniors, availability of daycare, etc. But the point is that these negotiations are not possible for most of the women in their workspaces, because we know, as work is structured, most of the women are represented in in informal workspaces. They are construction workers, they are agricultural workers, they are working as maid servants. There are so many women working in informal sector in highly exploitative contexts. So when we are talking about workspaces and ambitions and responsibilities and its achievements, we need to be conscious of these differentiations when we are talking about the gendered nature of women's work. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was quite intriguing. Now I would go forward to our last speaker and our fourth speaker, that is Professor Suneetha Rani. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Antara. Thank you for having me here. I think the topic is really thought provoking. Uh, Trying to compare workplace and home and trying to debate like which is a better home. For me, this is very nuanced because we can ask a question like this only about women, not men. Right? We think it is important to ask this question to understand like where they feel comfortable, which also means that they are not comfortable in certain places. Not every space invites, welcomes, accommodates women, and they're made to feel like others, or they're made to feel like those who have no entitlements in some of these spaces. I think that is one reason that we the question is constantly on our mind, like where do women feel comfortable, have an entitlement? And also, let me also draw your attention to a very, very important word that is very crucial in feminist discourse, that is rights. Okay, I think rights is the most important aspect in women's lives because they've been fighting for rights both at home as well as in the workplace for almost centuries. Think Mary Wollstonecraft wrote that vindication of the rights of women, like women in 18th century, and we are still talking or not talking about rights, be it workplace or be it home. When we talk about responsibilities, ambitions, and achievements, somewhere the rights is missing. And it is also a discourse is being constructed around responsibilities and achievements and ambition. Of course, ambitions and achievements are very, very crucial, no doubt about it. But which workplace, and which home are we talking about? If we look at the range of autobiographies by Indian women, starting from 19th century, from Cornelia Sorabji's India Calling, published in 1935, in early 20th century, to Baby Haldar's autobiography, Against All Odds. Both of them were talking about work. Both of them were talking about quote unquote ambitions, but the workplaces are very, very different. Both were struggling to succeed in their workplaces. Both were facing discrimination as women and also as women belonging to a certain or carrying a certain identity. So, diversity of work, diversity of workplace, and diversity of home, all of them together decide which is a better home or which is not a home in itself or which doesn't make women feel at home. And feminist discourse, feminist writers have extensively written about the concept of homemaking or homemakers. Homemaking itself has no rights but only has responsibilities, only has expectations from women. As some of the women feminist writers have pointed out, there is a clear distinction between house and home. House is concrete, home is abstract. House belongs to the man, man owns the house, and woman has the responsibility to turn it into a home. Once he achieves a house, it is there concretely. But for a woman, it is a constant endeavor to make it a home and to keep it a home, to continue to preserve it as a home. So, where her work is not recognized, where her work is not endorsed, or constantly evaluated, estimated, found fault with, probably that is one of the reasons why women prefer a workplace, because their work is valued, it is evaluated, but it is also paid. Their skills are recognized with all the prejudice that they have to face, with all the discrimination, at least some workplaces practice. Despite all that, there is a role that is given to them where there is recognition, where their work is valued, and their absence is actually recognized because some part of work, at least some part of work, officially, formally is owned and is endorsed by women at workplace. But at the same time, romanticizing, glorifying a workplace also probably is not correct, in the sense, if workplaces are that ideal, then there wouldn't have been a need for the Posh Act. Why did women have to fight for so long to get an act to feel like on par with other workers, other employees, to work without any harassment? I think that is a very important point that also has to be kept in mind when we are looking at the workplace. Probably, I was wondering when I first looked at the topic of discussion, I was thinking, what are the criteria for comparison or for contrast? Quickly, what came to my mind was that no rights in family and rights in the workplace. Probably that is one of the most contrasting things, at least formally speaking. Yeah, like my previous speakers, panelists pointed out, there are also informal sectors and there are informal workers in the formal sector as well. And these are mostly women. So, what does it mean to them? And then uh, also the gaze that follows them, the judging gaze at home, the judging gaze at the workplace, does it really make them feel comfortable? I was looking at some of the women's autobiographies, like an autobiography by the former chairperson of State Bank of India, Arundhati Bhattacharya, Indomitable, a working woman's notes on work, life, and leadership, published in 2022. Then, on Balance by Leela Seth, India's first woman Chief Justice of a High Court, who reflected on her legal career, motherhood, and the pursuit of justice. But on par with these autobiographies, there were also autobiographies by women whose workplace was very, very, very different, like Nalini Jamila's autobiography of a sex worker. What is her workplace? Where does she work? And what is her work? And does she feel, is there a difference between her home and her workplace? Where does she feel more at home? Does she really feel at home at all? And similarly, Baby Haldar's autobiography as well. Identity of the workplace, identity of women, and the socio-cultural locations of women, all of them decide where women feel more at home in a context where family is defined in a stereotypical manner, where workplace is also defined in a stereotypical manner. How do we really define a workplace? How do we really define a home? Are we all only talking about a heterosexual family? Are we only talking about a man led, man heading family? Are we only talking about the couple and children and the grandparents as a unit of a family? Are we talking about a workplace which is formal, informal, formal, informal? What kind of comparisons are we drawing? And all these lead us to think about different combinations and different dynamics as well. Like my previous panelist spoke about it, that yeah, once you step in, you forget everything about or everything else. And in fact, even if you're not feeling well, you're disturbed, you're carrying home, but still your workplace makes you feel very, very comfortable when you love your work, and when you feel that entitlement in a workplace when your work is valued. But at the same time, the workplace and home, the double bind, that also increase the emotional and physical burden of women, that constantly make them that constantly make them anxious about becoming a superwoman. That is also a point in question. I'm reminded of a feminist writer, Shila Lolita, who writes poetry in Telugu, who says that when a man goes out, he simply puts on his dress, he puts on his shirt. But when a woman steps out, she wears her home as well. She takes her home along with her. Then is there a possibility of feeling more at home in the workplace when a woman is made to carry her home along with her? And when what about a Dalit woman's workplace? Uh, in fact, this is also connected to the discussion that happened earlier. Yeah, we have started recognizing, we no longer use the word prostitution, but we use the word sex work. But Dalit feminists have also been asking this question, like, can sex ever be work? And why sex is, particularly the commercialized sex, is being projected as work, which is very, very problematic for, particularly for women of marginalized communities who are pushed into sexual exploitation in the name of tradition, or even in the name of migration or in trafficking. So this makes it like the multidimensional workplace, the multidimensional home, or the intersectional, the intersecting women and the women's identities, the intersecting identities of workplace, all of them come together and problematize this question of which is a better home. Can home ever be good, bad, better unless it is redefined? Can a workplace be considered or thought about as a better home unless the diverse identities or the diverse locations of the workplace are uh, examined in depth? These are some questions that came to my mind when I looked at the topic. Probably I'd like to discuss more, for instance, more context when we move on to the discussion. But just one, I would like to close this short presentation with one question. Women, responsibilities, ambitions, achievements, is the workplace a better home for women? And can we also apply this to trans women? If we apply this to trans women, how do we look at this question? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That was quite intriguing. Now we will go forward to the question answer session. And my first question is to Professor Rajeev Kamineni. Sir, in your opinion, in what ways do you think that male dominated workplace cultures, which is consisting of masculinity, patriarchy, impact the women experience? You have mentioned about a workplace which can be male dominated as well as female dominated or women dominated. But if I take that the workplace is only dominated by the males, how can that impact upon women's experience?
That's a good question, Antara, because see, the domination in the office depends on the rank in which a woman is working. If the examples given as State Bank of India chairperson or the head of a large corporation, if they're in the office as the boss, then the rest of the equation for the woman changes because they're in control. But if they are marginalized and if there are only one or two women in an office of 100 employees where 98% of the others are men and only 2% are women, then they have to carve a niche for themselves by making their work more significant. Because when they're going into an office space, uh, it's interesting that you mentioned in the one of the questions you mentioned the example of Jhumpa Lahiri's book, In Other Words. That's a good, because I've always wanted to learn the Spanish language and to go and learn something, where Jhumpa Lahiri does that by going to Rome and learning Italian. So you go to office to learn something. You go to office to exhibit your talent, your skills, your qualifications. So in that situation, you are in the office on your own right because you have a place in that office. If men are dominating, if it's a male dominated office, a woman can hold her own place because she is in the office because it's a right for her. She's been interviewed, she's been given the job. Or if she's a startup entrepreneur, she's the one who started the business. Or if she's someone who's been transferred into that role, she's got there because of her qualifications and her ability. So when they go there and say that I'm here because I have the right to be here, I'm here because I stand as an individual and my identity is a place in this office. It doesn't matter who's dominating, because the office as a unit cannot function without that woman. The office as an integral part of a business cannot function without that woman. So the role becomes very essential, and it doesn't matter if there are more men or women in the office. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Uh, the answer was equally interesting as well as like your presentation. Now, my next question is to Ms. Rianka Sarkar. Ma'am, you have addressed the topic from various perspectives, and I was wondering if you can address it in respect of partition literature, where women writers like Krishna Sopti in her memoir, A Gujarat Here and a Gujarat There, had talked about her newfound employment. So, do you think, or according to you, how does partition literature and autobiographies written by women who found employment at that period impact each other?
Okay, Antara, thank you so much for the fascinating question about partition literature. Now you see the intersection of these two, literary domains creates, a particularly a very rich ground for understanding how historical trauma and economic necessity both reshaped, women's identities in post-independence India. Now, talking about Krishna Sopti's autobiographical work, A Gujarat Here and Gujarat There, what makes her work particularly significant is how it captures the intersection of geographical displacement and economic necessity. So partition didn't displace women just physically. In fact, it fundamentally altered their relationship with work and public space. And for women like Sopti, employment in post-partition India wasn't just a career choice, but it was a survival strategy. Just like the vast amount of refugees had to pick up all kind of odd works because it was a survival strategy. And in Bengal, partition had some emancipatory effects on refugee women from East Bengal who had to take up odd jobs like helping in the families or entering the public space and also participate in political movements. Now, many of the women probably were housewife in the past, but they had to come out of their space and go to the public domain, and this is the first time they explored working outside. Now, what we notice here is that when traditional homes were literally lost, so professional spaces became not just economic lifelines, but also spaces of identity construction. So the workplace wasn't chosen, you can say, as an alternative to home, but it became the new foundation, upon which home could be rebuilt.
Thank you, ma'am. My next question is to Professor Nishi. Ma'am, you have talked about your research on women who are into academia and who are continuously going through a feeling of guilt. So I was wondering that do you think that women who are ambitious in life, they are compromising on the role of being mother, or this is how they are perceived and their identity is formed in this line?
So thank you for your question. Uh, in fact, I was saying something a little bit more different. Maybe I was not clear. So there are some women who talked about the guilt, but they're also talking about conscious work that they do to take motherhood as an important role that they are engaged in. So they use their academic knowledge and their education. Sometimes they are hard on themselves. In my narratives, they are talking about how their education and their learning should in some ways make them be better mothers. Okay, so this is like a kind of a strong expectation from oneself about doing this work of mothering under stressful conditions, in a good way that is there. But this is not only because they are seeing themselves to be stretched, but it's also got to do with them understanding the structures of workplace and home, in which context men are not sharing the responsibilities at home in the same way as the women are expected to do, particularly in reference to children. Okay, so supportive men does not translate itself in terms of men doing concrete work of an equal nature at home so as to help one's partner in not having long shifts of work, not, not only at the workplace but at home too. So that's the problem, and women are able to most of in we compared women from Brazil, India, and South Africa. So the South African academics were very strong and critical of their partners and husbands for their lack of role. They were angry, but and so some Brazilian women, but the Indian women who were in our study were not angry with their husbands. They were sort of uh, circumventing that area of critique. They were happy with their household help, or they were unhappy about that unstable help, but they were more appreciative of the family support they got from their mothers and sometimes mothers in law, which was actually showing that the stereotypical organization of the home on gender lines is something that was a lived experience, and that put a lot of strain on women, and also meant that when they prioritized motherhood, they lost out in terms of accomplishments at workplace. They had delayed promotions, their phds were late, completed late, which also impacted their upward mobility. They did not write as much as they wished they could, So the comparison was not with men, the comparison was with themselves, their abilities, and their optimal usage of their own academic abilities towards working out good careers. That's where it was coming out. Yes. But they are
Thank
also
you, ma'am.
somehow resigned in the sense that these are the choices we make. uh, so it's something, a kind of peace they talked about buying through understanding that it would be worse if they could not be engaged in this uh, thinking work as educated women. It would be worse. So they were not talking of themselves as powerless, but they were talking of themselves as having worked out some kind of a solution for themselves to take both these, the workplace and the home, as spaces they need to keep in some balance, so that they are not completely flabbergasted, completely unpeaceful, and they want to feel their power. So they are not talking about powerlessness, they are talking about responsibility, and they are talking about being responsible, and they are proud of their being responsible, which I think is connected very well to what Sunita ji is saying. It's about rights. So, what happens when some of these women who are, let's say, really in professions where they can speak, they can write, not only for themselves but for other women, they are not really talking the rights language, but they are, in a sense, happy and thankful for the balance they have been able to achieve individually. But structurally, they are critiquing it, but they don't critique particularly the man who is benefiting at home from these structural arrangements. That does not come up in my narratives collected in India.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, I would like to ask a question to Professor Suneetha Rani. Ma'am, the question is, how can Gayatri Spivak's interrogation of representation, especially her distinction between speaking for, which is the proxy, and speaking to, the address, help us critically read the autobiographical narratives of working women, particularly those from subaltern, Dalit, or marginalized locations?
Yeah, thank you, Antara. Uh, in fact, I'd like to draw from one of Spivak's articles that is translating into English, which is a very nuanced article and which is also which gives us a clue to understand this question of representation. Who represents whom? And what happens when you are representing someone you consider or others consider as superior to you or as inferior to you? So, that question of who can represent whom is the first question. But the lived body, we have also moved from lived experiences to lived body experiences. That way, I think that her concept of subaltern speaking becomes very significant, And of course, subalterns, I'm putting it within quotes because it's a very controversial, debatable term as well, which is not acceptable to many uh, activists and writers from the marginalized context as well. The word was questioned. But we have moved towards that space, that phase where particularly women and people from the marginalized communities are emphatically saying that we can represent ourselves and you do not have to represent ourselves, because we do not want to remain subjects, but we want to present subjective narratives. Even in feminist discourse, subjectivity, situated knowledge become very, very crucial, because only those who have gone through that experience would know how to articulate it. I think that is what has made many critics or writers critique, I won't say criticize, but critique Spivak's context or concept of who can speak for whom, because we have moved on from there. For instance, Sidney Smith says that autobiography is like talking back. Yeah, if you look at initial autobiographies of women, particularly, it is like answering back or answering, talking. But then, gradually, if you look at the contemporary autobiographies, they are not just complaining about the oppressor, they are not just writing in response to the oppression, but also they are narrating stories on their own. Because it's also like, what is the catalyst kind of a question that we quite often ask. It's not just oppression that always becomes the theme of one's autobiographical narrative. I think this progression is something which is very, very crucial, because we have moved on from representation to lived experiences, to lived body experiences, which are very, very diverse. And this also takes me to one of the points that was made by other panelists, that is, when we talk about home or when we talk about workplace, it is not always men versus women, women versus men, or it is just like, dividing it only on the basis of men and women. It is also the uh, systemic division. Allow me to bring in Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who said that India is a context where not just the labor is divided, but the laborers are also divided. Be it caste, be it class, be it the position, that is the job, or gender, or the background, whatever it is, all these things also come in to decide the identities of people, be it at home or at workplace. That is, going back to Professor Nishi, who talked about the structural uh, agencies or influences, the structural facts. It is the systemic influences that constantly decide who stands where. And similarly, not so much Spivak, but we have read that even masculinities, not all masculinities are powerful. There are hegemonic masculinities, there are marginalized masculinities as well. A workplace actually goes by all these divisions. So that is why it is very difficult to decide, or let me not use the word difficult, but very challenging to decide which workplace becomes better than a home for whom. I think there is a need to problematize it. Thank you, Antara.
Thank you, ma'am. And with that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. I thank each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot as well. We are grateful to you for taking out time from your busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. And this is to remind that we are calling for submissions on working women in literature, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Antara. Thank you for
Good
organizing.
night.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.